Okay folks, welcome back from the Mardi Gras holiday. I hope that you all got your exams in early so that you could go out and celebrate. As we begin the second third of the course, I want to take just a moment to reflect on where we've been. In the first third of the course, Dr. Ross and I sketched three major themes in the early modern period, the 1500s, 1600s, and early 1700s. The creation of a new world economic system, the rise of European nation-states, and the creation of new kinds of inequality. Now, in the late 1700s, people began to really challenge that modern world economic system, the global dominion of European nation-states, and new forms of inequality. And those challenges could be violent. And that resulted in a series of revolutions. So historians often refer to the period from the late 1700s to the early 1800s as the Age of Revolutions. Today we will examine the American Revolution, the first in a series of these major revolutions. We'll use this case study to explore why people rebelled against the world order that had been created over the course of the 1500s, 1600s, and early 1700s. And we'll grapple with some of the shortcomings that are immediately apparent in the Age of Revolutions. So, our major questions for the day will be these. First, what caused the American Revolution? What caused the American Revolution? Second, how did European thinkers like John Locke, who you read for today, how did European thinkers like John Locke influence the American Revolution? Third, what were revolutionaries fighting for? High ideals or economic self-interest? It's very much an open question. And finally, what did American revolutionaries really achieve? And just as importantly, what did they fail to achieve? So, the American Revolution is often presented pretty simplistically. Right? It's often reduced to a contest over high ideals, liberty versus tyranny. Or even more simplistically, and sort of the third grade level mantra that you all probably know by heart, taxation without representation. But of course, such reductive, simplistic representations conceal as much as they reveal. The reality is much different, much more complicated. There were, of course, high ideals at stake in the American Revolution. But there was also a lot of economic self-interest at stake. There were high ideals derived from European thinkers like John Locke. So you read a good little portion of Locke's second treatise of government for today. And in that document, you'll see that John Locke argues that human beings have natural rights, a set of natural rights. Rights to life, liberty, equality, property, and especially the right to consent to any government that purports to rule you. And you have the right to your own life, the right to liberty, the right to equality, the right to property, and especially the right to consent to any government that purports to rule you. And of course, when you read the Declaration of Independence, when you read the Declaration of Independence, you can see pretty clearly that Thomas Jefferson incorporated many of those high ideals derived from Locke and other European thinkers. However, as I'll point out a little bit later, the Declaration of Independence also makes it very, very clear that economic self-interest played a key role in the American Revolution. So, it's probably a bad idea to focus on high ideals and ignore that economic self-interest. Because in the end, American revolutionaries disagreed profoundly about what exactly they were fighting for. And that can make it difficult to determine what exactly the American Revolution achieved and what it failed to achieve. Now, to understand what caused the American Revolution, how European thinkers influenced it, what revolutionaries fought for, and what they achieved, we need to start with some geopolitical context. We've got to have some geopolitical context. In the most sort of crudest sense, over the course of the 1600s and 1700s, European states fought a series of wars over the control of colonies in the Americas, but also in Africa, South America, and Asia. These colonial wars all sort of culminate in the so-called 7 Years' War, from 1754 to 1763. The 7 Years' War. Now, the 7 Years' War actually began in North America, but it pretty quickly engulfed lots of other regions in the world. Theaters of conflict opened in the Caribbean, in Europe itself, the west coast of Africa, the Mediterranean, and Asia. So in that sense, you can think of the 7 Years' War as the first truly global war. Now, we don't have time to go into much detail about the 7 Years' War, but in the end, British victory in the 7 Years' War totally redrew the colonial maps of Asia and the Americas. Before the 7 Years' War, Britain, the green bits here, France, the blue part, and Spain, the pink part, Britain, France, and Spain all claimed big chunks of North America before the French and Indian War. But afterwards, after the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, it's called the French and Indian War in the Americas. When you're referring to the big conflict, it's 7 Years' War. In any case, after the 7 Years' War, the British claimed virtually everything between the Atlantic coast and the Mississippi River. On the global stage, Britain emerged as the foremost colonial empire, eclipsing France and Spain, the Netherlands, everybody. Britain was a true global superpower. But Great Britain had also incurred tremendous debt to fight the 7 Years' War. So she was victorious, but Britain was burdened by a crippling war debt at the end of the 7 Years' War. Now, British colonists in North America were thrilled with the British Empire's victory in the 7 Years' War. Wealthy colonial land speculators believed they were now free to take all this land from its Native American owners by force, parcel it out into small chunks, resell that to small farmers, and reap enormous profits. So, wealthy American colonial speculators believed that the 7 Years' War will benefit them economically. Taking native land, reselling it to common farmers is in their economic self-interest. But of course, there were still some 200,000 Native American people who own and occupy all of this land. They were not defeated in the 7 Years' War. They were not conquered. And they had every intention of continuing to defend their lives, their liberty, and their property against aggressive colonials. And the reality was that Britain simply could not afford to wage a new series of Indian wars to help colonials take land from Native Americans. The debt burden was just too much. So, British imperial officials take action to prevent any disastrously expensive Indian wars in North America. British imperial officials adopt a new land policy. Call it the Proclamation of 1763. To prevent disastrously expensive wars with Indians, British imperial officials adopt this new land policy. Call it the Proclamation of 1763. Basically, it does a lot of things, but basically, the proclamation bans all British colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Proclamation of 1763 bans all British colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. So you can see that represented on this map by this red line, right? The so-called Proclamation line. No settlement west of the line. The idea here is to avoid expensive Indian wars by preventing land-hungry colonial speculators and common farmers from invading Native American lands. Well, as you might imagine, British colonists in North America were outraged by this new land policy. They perceived it as unfair. It damaged their economic interests. So, common farmers poured into Native American lands and squatted illegally. Just as imperial officials had feared, reckless colonials provoked a bloody war with Native Americans known as Pontiac's War. In Pontiac's War, well-armed Native Americans killed some 2,000 British colonials and took another 2,000 captive. common colonials and elites alike were outraged all over again. And they blamed this imperial land policy and the imperial government in general for Pontiac's War. It was disingenuous, of course. They started it and then blamed the imperial government for it, but that's what they did. So, what I want you to get out of this, big picture here, tension between British colonials in North America and the imperial government is growing because this imperial land policy does not align with the economic interests of some colonials. This tension between colonials and the imperial government over land policy gets worse when Great Britain adopts a new tax policy. As I suggested a moment ago, at the end of the 7 Years' War, Great Britain emerged victorious. She's a global empire, a global superpower, but she's also deeply in debt. She's got a real debt crisis on her hands. So, the imperial government has to do something to confront this debt crisis. People at home in the British Isles were being taxed to the limit to pay down this war debt from the 7 Years' War. And by contrast, colonials paid very little in taxes. Just to put a number on it, 26 to 1. That's the ratio. People at home in the British Isles paid taxes 26 times higher than the taxes paid by colonials in North America. So the solution seemed obvious. The British Parliament reasoned that it was time for the colonies to contribute their fair share to managing Britain's global empire. But colonials were not interested in paying their fair share. They had been getting a free ride for generations. North American colonials had enjoyed all the benefits of membership in the British Empire without paying any of the costs. It's hard to get people to pay for things they're accustomed to getting for free. Parliament understood that. Parliament understood there would be some resistance, so they tried to craft a tax policy that seemed reasonable. First, Parliament passed the Sugar Act of 1764 to adjust the tax on sugar imported from the Caribbean to the North American colonies. Now, imperial officials knew that colonials had been illegally smuggling French sugar from the island, or from the colony of Saint-Domingue, for years. So, the Sugar Act of 1764 was designed to put an end to that illegal smuggling, plus raise a little revenue to help pay down Britain's crippling war debt. Indeed, the Sugar Act is in fact not a tax increase. The Sugar Act is a tax cut. The Sugar Act actually cut the existing tax on British sugar in half. Parliament reasoned that colonials in North America would just buy the cheaper, legal British sugar instead of going to the trouble to smuggle illegal French sugar. Plus, if you don't want to pay the tax, you don't have to buy sugar. It's a pretty easy tax to avoid. But colonials complained constantly about the sugar tax, the Sugar Act. They said, even though it's been cut in half, the tax is still too high. Plus, the Sugar Act burdened elite sugar importers the most. So they complain the loudest, and they keep on smuggling illegal French sugar. So, Parliament hears the complaints, understands what the issues are, and Parliament responds to colonial concerns. They create a new kind of tax that will spread out the tax burden instead of putting it all on elite sugar importers. A stamp tax. Now, the Stamp Act of 1765 was a new kind of tax for the colonies, but stamp taxes in general had been a common revenue generator in the British Isles for decades by this point. All right, so Parliament is thinking, we've used these kinds of taxes before, they work in the British Isles, surely they'll work over in the colonies. Basically, the government prints up a bunch of stamped paper, like these examples here. And any official business has to be conducted using the official stamped paper. So that can mean everything from court records, to wills, to newspapers, to cargo manifests for merchant ships. Any little bit of business has to be conducted on stamped paper. When you buy the stamped paper, you pay the stamp tax. So virtually everybody would end up paying a stamp tax at some point. From elite merchants and lawyers to common tradesmen. So it sort of spreads out the burden a little more than the Sugar Act. And again, Parliament was astonished by the colonial reaction. This time, there were riots in the streets. Violence against tax collectors. Colonials complained that this stamp tax was unjust because they were not represented in Parliament. Colonials had no way to give their consent to tax policies created by Parliament. So think about the differences here between the stamp tax, the sugar tax, and the Proclamation of 1763. Right at this point, colonials are adding a new layer of their argument against imperial policy. Now they're making an argument about a high ideal. We don't have the ability to consent to the policies being imposed on us. Up to this point, they had only been making economic self-interest arguments. So colonials have now added another layer to their argument. It's not just an argument about economic self-interest, it's also an argument about the ideal of the consent of the governed. And again, Parliament hears colonial complaints, right? They respond to colonial concerns. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. They also repealed taxes on most goods imported into the colonies, except for one last tax on one imported luxury item, tea. And in fact, Parliament even cut that one last remaining tax on imported tea. Again, not a tax increase, but a series of tax cuts. Parliament thinks again it's responded to all colonial concerns. Once again, colonials went bananas, and Parliament was stunned. In 1773, 1773, a mob of common people, egged on by elites, boarded 3 tea ships in Boston Harbor. Over the course of several hours, they methodically broke open 342 chests of tea and dumped every leaf from every chest into the harbor, destroying in the process $750,000 worth of property. And that's, just to be clear, that's $750,000 in modern money. Now, that is a fairly well organized and very expensive attack on private property. So after the destruction of the tea in 1773, Parliament's at it. All right, things have finally gone too far. Every effort at reasonable debate and problem solving has failed, so it's time for a little tough love. So Parliament punished the colony of Massachusetts with a series of laws called the Intolerable Acts. Now, we don't need to dwell on the details of the Intolerable Acts. We don't need to go into detail on the particular punishments. What I want you to understand is this. The Intolerable Acts terrified elite colonial leaders in all of the other British colonies in North America. So, in 1774, In 1774, elite leaders from all of the British colonies in North America gathered in Philadelphia to discuss what to do about this volatile situation. And this first meeting in Philadelphia becomes known as the First Continental Congress. Just to be clear, at this meeting of the First Continental Congress in 1774, nobody is talking about independence. And no one even considers it. Everybody declares their undying loyalty to the empire. They simply argue that Parliament has exceeded its authority with recent tax and land policies. Policies that hurt colonial economic interests. So now, right, leaders in the First Continental Congress are thoroughly combining their high ideals about the consent of the governed with their economic self-interests. To try to resolve this situation, elites in the First Continental Congress create a series of modest boycotts of British goods. They're hoping to pressure Parliament into repealing the Intolerable Acts. Right? It's sort of non-violent economic disobedience. It's just a modest boycott. Such strategies had worked before, so the First Continental Congress was pretty optimistic they might work again. But this time it was not to be. This time it was not to be. In April 1775, open fighting broke out between British troops and colonial militias at the battles of Lexington and Concord. So again, we don't necessarily need to go into the details here. The upshot is by April of 1775, we've got a shooting war on our hands. Up to this point, colonials had insisted they were loyal subjects of the British Crown. They were loyal to the empire. They just feared that Parliament was exceeding its authority. But in early 1776, calls for independence from the British Empire got louder and louder. And in the summer of 1776, the Continental Congress took decisive action. They drafted a committee to draw up a Declaration of Independence. The committee appointed to draft this Declaration of Independence chose Thomas Jefferson to do the writing. He was well regarded as an excellent author, so they picked him to kind of do the heavy lifting of drafting the document. And Thomas Jefferson was heavily influenced by European thinkers like John Locke, and a lot of other thinkers who were part of sort of a broader intellectual movement in Europe known as the Enlightenment. Jefferson drew especially on John Locke, this English philosopher, with his ideas about natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Following John Locke, Jefferson wrote that people must consent to a social contract with any government to protect natural rights to life, liberty, and property. And Jefferson also followed Locke's argument that people had the right to rebel against a government if that government broke the social contract by failing to protect natural rights to life, liberty, and property. So, as you probably realized in reading the two documents, John Locke's legalistic reasoning is, pretty hard to take it all in. By contrast, Jefferson gives these high ideals, this mellifluous, almost poetic ring. Right? When Jefferson outlines those ideals, he makes them inspiring. Perhaps the most important words in American political life come from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, happiness sounds better than property, but Jefferson was drawing on Locke, so the people at the time would have understood happiness to be the right to property. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So all of John Locke's ideas are in there. Jefferson just makes them sound a lot better. But if you read the entire Declaration of Independence, something else becomes clear pretty quickly. This mellifluous, poetic statement of high ideals is one very tiny part of the Declaration. The vast majority of the document is a list of very specific grievances that really depict elite economic interests. I'll give you one example. Near the end of the document, Jefferson writes, he, referring to the king, he, the king, has excited domestic insurrections amongst us. And again, people reading this document in 1776 would have understood what that meant. Domestic insurrection means slave revolt. He's blaming the King of England for fomenting slave revolts. He has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. He's suggesting the King of England and imperial officials more generally are encouraging savage Indians to attack American farmers. So, the Declaration of Independence may be a statement of high ideals about liberty, equality, and consent. But it's also a concrete statement of elite economic interests in the right to hold slaves and take land from Native American people. Even this most idealistic of American political documents still harps on economic self-interest. Now, there's one other problem with the Declaration of Independence. It only declares colonies to be independent of the empire. It does not create new governments to rule American people. And as patriots began to debate what kind of government would best suit them, they quickly realized that they disagreed about what they were really fighting for. Some common Americans really took seriously those high ideals of liberty, equality, and consent. But for lots of other people, common farmers and elite speculators alike, the revolution was about fighting Indians and taking their land. It was about using slave labor on that land to enrich themselves. For many elites, perhaps most, the revolution was never about high ideals. It was about control. The elite men who signed the Declaration of Independence assume that they will control any new government at the local level or the central government level. Elites did not intend for common people to participate directly in government. They certainly did not intend for slaves, free black people, or women to participate directly in government. In the early years of the Revolution, elites in every state created a new state government. Most of those state governments, all of them really, could be described as republics. So, let me give you a thumbnail definition there. In the broadest sense, a republic, a republican form of government, is a government whose authority rests on the consent of the governed. In the broadest sense, a republic is a government in which authority rests on the consent of the governed. And that government exists only to promote the general welfare or the common good by protecting liberty. So that's all in keeping with the highest ideals espoused by John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. Right? a government whose authority rests on the consent of the governed, and a government that exists only to promote the general welfare, the common good. But it's also pretty vague, right? Liberty, equality, consent, the public good. What do those terms even mean? How do you define the public good? One of the greatest ironies of the American Revolution is that elites created new state governments that reinforced inequality. In every state, elites created state governments that reinforced inequality. I'll give you just a couple of examples. Guess how many of these new state governments gave women the right to vote? How many? 1. New Jersey. And New Jersey revoked women's right to vote within a few years. In virtually every state, only men who own property get to vote. For example, just to vote in the state of Maryland, you must own 50 acres of land or 30 pounds sterling in cash. So those numbers may not mean much to you, but let me put it another way. In Maryland, that property qualification to vote disqualified fully a third of free white men. Many of those were Continental Army veterans. If they're good enough to bleed on the battlefield for the cause, not good enough to vote because they don't own enough property. When the Revolution began, slavery was legal in every state. Now, by the 1790s, all northern states had abolished slavery in one way or another because they truly believed all of that idealistic talk about liberty, equality, and the consent of the governed. But southern states never even seriously considered abolishing slavery. There was simply too much money invested in it. So, what I want to get across here is that from the very beginning, big picture, from the very beginning, revolutionaries disagreed fundamentally on what exactly they were fighting for. The human right to liberty or the right to own property, including slaves. The right of elites to control society, to perpetuate inequality, or the natural rights of commons to liberty, equality, and consent. With that kind of internal conflict going on, it's amazing that this disorganized group of rebels could function well enough to fight a war at all. But fight they did. Although, to be fair, British armies won most of the battles in the Revolutionary War. In the end, what wins the Revolutionary War? French alliance. Without French allies, the U.S. would never have emerged victorious from the Revolutionary War. French guns, French money, French soldiers, and especially a French navy really enabled American victory, especially the key victory at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. If you count them all up, there were actually more French soldiers and sailors at Yorktown than there were Americans. So a French alliance made victory possible for Americans. After the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, the fighting was pretty much over. Negotiations dragged on for a couple of years, and finally, the United States and Great Britain signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, bringing the American Revolutionary War to a close. But remember, some common Americans truly believed in the highest ideals of the Revolution: liberty, equality, and consent. Elites feared that common people, women, slaves, even Native Americans, took those ideals a little too seriously. And elites were right to be afraid. In 1786, just a few years after the war ended, a Massachusetts farmer and Revolutionary War veteran named Daniel Shays led a rebellion against his government to protest tax policy that hurt him economically. Daniel Shays and his followers shut down courts in western Massachusetts because they were foreclosing on farms for failure to pay taxes. Think about that for a minute. In Massachusetts, as in most places, you must own property to qualify to vote. If you lose your land, you lose the right to vote. You lose your ability to consent or withhold consent from the government that rules you. In response, the Massachusetts state government sent an army to put down the Shays Rebellion. American elites were shocked to find Americans rising up against their rightful government. I feel that's a little naive, but that's what they thought. So, after putting down Shays' Rebellion by force, American elites decide they need to take some further action to ensure their control of this new polity. In 1787, elites from every state gathered in Philadelphia to create a powerful central government that could tax the people at will and force them to obey. And over the course of summer 1787, those 55 elite white men drafted the United States Constitution. So I'll close with just a few words on the Constitution. To most American people at the time, this new Constitution, released at the end of 1787, looked like the beginning of tyranny. To most Americans at the time, the Constitution looked like a betrayal of core revolutionary principles. principles of liberty, equality, and consent. So, people demanded a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 changes, or the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The Bill of Rights protected the individual liberties that most Americans saw as sort of the core of revolutionary ideals. You know, things like the freedom of speech and of the press. But, in a very real sense, the Constitution failed to protect liberty, equality, and the consent of the governed. One of the key issues, of course, was slavery. Southerners at the Constitutional Convention made sure that the U.S. Constitution protected legal slavery in a variety of ways. Supposedly, the Constitution creates a government that rests on the consent of the people. But it doesn't. In fact, the Constitution separates leaders several steps from the consent of the people. I'll give you a couple of examples. The people do not vote directly for the president. The people could not vote directly for their senators. All judges were appointed and served for life, free from any concern with the consent of the people. So really, under the Constitution, common people only got to vote for members of the House of Representatives, one half of one branch of government. That's it. That's all they get. And all states in the United States still restricted voting rights. Only property-owning white men got to vote. No women, no black people, no poor people. So, it seems fairly clear. It seems fairly clear that American revolutionaries failed to achieve the highest ideals laid out in the Declaration of Independence. But on the other hand, they let the genie out of the bottle. Those ideals of liberty, equality, and the consent of the governed could no longer be contained. The struggle to make those ideals real continued in the United States. They continue today. And the struggle would soon begin anew in France. Dr. Ross will pick up the story there next time with the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789. Until then, meditate on this notion of principle, high ideal versus self-interest. What did Americans fight for? What did they achieve? Depends on who you ask.